Thank you very much. I want to thank everyone who's behind me. There's a bunch of people behind me, different organizations represented here, and I'll get to them all in a minute. I want to thank City Council President Janey, who's with us today, City Councilor Nisha Sabi George, City Councilor Kenzie Bach, City Councilor Eddie Flynn, City Councilor Ricardo Arroyo. Did I get everybody? City Councilor Matt O'Malley. I want to thank all of them for their advocacy here. We're joined by members of the Machinists Union, Mike Verabedian, Jimmy Evers from the Commons Union, Lee Matsueda from Community Labor United, Rick Domino from A Better City. We have Karen Chin from the Chinese Progressives. We have lots of people here today that are concerned about the actions of the Fiscal Management Control Board that's being proposed for 2 weeks from now. We're here today to stand together against the proposed cuts to the MBTA. The MBTA is an essential service here in Boston. The MBTA is an essential service in Greater Boston. The MBTA is an essential service in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Their budget challenges are real and significant, but moving forward with these service cuts, especially right now, hurts our residents and is short-sighted. It will hurt our city's ability to recover from this pandemic. It will create lasting impacts for years to come for so many different constituencies and so many different businesses here in the city of Boston. We're at a turning point right now in our nation. We'll soon have a new partner in Washington who's actually talking about a federal stimulus package. There's progress on the current federal funding for transit, which may make the proposed cuts unnecessary. With the recent developments on the COVID-19 vaccines, we could see, and we will see, an increase in ridership soon. With all these changes, we cannot rush this decision. These cuts would hurt low-income workers the wrong way. It ends subway service for late-night workers, people who do not own a car, who can come into work. That impacts our essential workers as well, who are keeping our city running and don't have an option to working from home. The cuts that are being proposed would hurt our residents with disabilities, and that's wrong. Our most vulnerable members of our society might not have cars or anyone to drive them where they need to go. These cuts would hurt our veterans from their health care in the middle of a pandemic, and that's wrong. Those proposed cuts on the E-Line service to Mission Hill and the VA hospital. More than 30% of the veterans that the VA serves relies on the MBTA. We're joined today also by our Commissioner of Veterans Affairs, John Santiago. The VA is always also providing COVID testing for our veterans, where our veterans go to get tested. We're giving one message to go get tested, and the MBTA is sending another message saying we're not going to take you there. Councilor Bach and Councilor Flynn have been advocating against cutting the E-Line service from the very beginning. Councilor Flynn works with the Disabled American Veterans Group, who are concerned about these cuts. I mentioned Councilor Santiago. I call him John. Rob Santiago. He knows how much our veterans across our country depend on public transit. Today, I want to remind everyone, today is Pearl Harbor Day. It's a day when we remember the sacrifice of the brave men and women who served our country. They deserve our gratitude, not a reduction in the service that they rely on every day. These cuts would hurt our public health and our climate. It would cause more crowded bus and trains, increase the risk of spreading COVID-19. These cuts would ultimately hurt our recovery from COVID-19. A recent Public Goods Coalition study made up of transit workers and riders across the Commonwealth estimates that these cuts would threaten more than 800 jobs. We don't need to cut jobs, we need to add jobs at this particular moment. These cuts would move the goal line further down. The bottom line here is that these cuts are just simply wrong. They would hurt workers. They would discourage ridership. They would slow our recovery. They'd create a bigger problem down the road. And many people said, where do you make up for the money? Be creative. Look at your budgets. I was in the legislature in 1997, and there was 3 times where we had to make drastic cuts. In this particular case, it's not even about raising revenue at this particular moment because the ridership is not there. It's about realigning our priorities. here in our city budget, the city council this year and myself, we cut $65 million out of the budget. We're able to look at our debt and realign some of our debt and make some cuts and put some hiring freezes in place. We're looking at if we have to make some decisions as we further go off in public works, lay off in parks and recreation, lay off in transportation. That's not the first instinct. So I'm asking and I'm demanding that the Fiscal Management Review will go back, sit down with the legislature, and come up with a plan that's an equitable plan that works all along. Cutting MBTA service will set us back further in the Commonwealth. We have a few speakers here today. I'm going to bring the first one up. It's the president of the Boston City Council, Councilor Janey.
Good morning. Let me get my glasses. Good morning. As was said, my name is Kim Janey, and I have the honor of serving as the president of the most diverse city council in Boston's history. I'm proud to join Mayor Walsh and many of my colleagues who are here, Councilor Arroyo, Councilor O'Malley, Councilor Flynn, Councilor Bach, and Councilor Asabi George. I also want to acknowledge Community Labor United, the Machinists Union, and A Better City, who are all here with us this morning. I want to also lift up the advocacy of organizations like ACE, Livable Streets, and the Boston Cyclists Union, who have also been on the front lines in this battle to protect and restore MBTA service and the fight against fare increases and instead for free buses. Yes, I said free buses. Access to public transit is important now more than ever. We are in the midst of the second surge of a global pandemic, and we are more reliant than ever on essential workers in our communities, many of whom depend on public transit and need it to be reliable, accessible, and affordable. Proposed cuts undermine the needs of our essential workers and the sacrifices they are making to protect our communities. The proposed cuts would add an unnecessary strain to our economic recovery, as many other workers also rely on public transportation. Furthermore, taking into consideration the need to maintain strict social distancing guidelines in public spaces, cuts will serve to result in crowded trains and buses, which will negatively impact commuters' abilities to stay safe. There are already gross inequities in MBTA service without the proposed cuts. It is no secret that there are large gaps in service in lower income communities of color. These communities are routinely underserved, with black commuters spending 64 more hours on buses per year than white commuters. As someone who does not own a car, I often rely on public transportation. In fact, I took a bus and a train to get here this morning. I understand many of the challenges. Long wait times, schedule inconsistencies, and street congestion are just some of the issues that could be mitigated with higher investment in the T, not cuts. The Boston City Council has long been a champion on these issues. We have proposed moving towards a fare-free public transportation system, starting with our buses. And like public schools and public libraries, public transit is a public good, and we should treat it as such. Finally, the so-called temporary cuts have had significant long-term impacts in the past, and begs the question, when will services be brought back? The answer, probably never. Over the past decade, fares have consistently increased and service has continued to diminish. These cuts are in line with a long history of defunding essential public services and transportation in particular. The COVID-19 crisis cannot and must not be used as a front to continue the dismantling of services our communities so desperately need. We are here this morning to say no to any cuts in service. Thank you.
We're also joined by City Councilor Frank Baker this morning as well. Thank you, Councilor Baker. With that, I will turn the floor over to Lee Matsueda from the Community Labor United.
Good morning. Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here serving as the executive director of Community Labor United, a very dynamic organization that's brought together community and labor organizations to fight for economic justice, environmental justice, gender and racial justice. Of course, thank you, Mayor Walsh, for inviting us to be a part of this event today. We're so grateful to have a friend, an advocate like you in City Hall that understands the issues of poor and working people and their families. He cares about this situation. He's spoken out on this issue. And when he does, when other mayors do, when the City Council does, when the T Advisory Council does, and when we do, we're in unity with the Greater Boston residents who oppose these cuts. Also an honor to be here with my friends from the Public Transit Public Good Coalition, Mike from the Machinists, Jim from 589, and of course Karen from Chinese Progress Association. But I have to really thank the workers and the riders in the Public Transit Public Good Coalition. Some are here today representing over 30 community and labor organizations. You've made your voices heard. Hundreds took to the street during this time of COVID for a rolling rally in November. Their voices have been heard at countless T-board meetings and other T meetings on this proposal. And the data shows, and it's clear, in a recent survey, more than 75% of residents are concerned about the impacts these cuts will have on the safety for riders and workers. The impacts are going to be on all essential workers, healthcare workers, grocery workers, childcare providers, janitors, and they're going to be massive. And we know that this proposed unsafe cuts will jeopardize the conditions in which our essential workers work. It's going to jeopardize the safety of the T, which has already experienced record derailments under recent years of cutting budgets and cutting corners. And then, of course, there's the impact on the people that we depend on to operate and maintain our public transit system. From a report that was just released, it's clear that the bulk of the layoffs are likely to come from the ranks of bus and train operators and motor persons. This is a group of workers that's largely non-white. 50% are black, and about half of them live in communities where COVID rates are above 4%. The largest group of operators and drivers live in Dorchester, here in Boston, where the health and economic toll of the pandemic has been among the worst in the state. We cannot stand for this. Public sector jobs like those at the T have been historically a source of middle-class stability, especially for black workers and their families. And good jobs and steady employment are critical during a time of crisis like the pandemic that's taken a harsh toll on communities of color. Massive layoffs at the T are going to likely worsen the pandemic outcomes by pushing hundreds more into joblessness and instability. I think the mayor mentioned it before. We have to allow time for relief and funding from the federal government to roll out support for the T. We can't jump to conclusions and make cuts that are going to be disastrous for our communities. We have to allow time for the vaccine. We have to protect opportunity for economic recovery. It's simply reckless to be making these cuts on a budget for FY22 with everything that's going on, especially when the impact is the greatest on those communities that have been hit hard by the pandemic. Now, we've seen, and I've been through cuts before, but not in times like this. We have a responsibility to stop these cuts. We call on Governor Baker, we call on the legislature, the T and its executives to take this opportunity to protect frontline workers, essential workers, and MBTA riders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee. I also want to introduce Darlene Lumbos, the head of the Greater Boston Labor Council, with us today. Thank you, Darlene. Now I'd like to ask Mike Varabedian from the Machinists Union to come up.
Good morning. My name is Mike Varabedian, and I'm the Assistant Directing Business Representative for the Machinists Union. I also represent Coalition of Unions at the MBTA, and I also represent the Public Transit Public Good Coalition. I'm joined here today by Jim Evers, who's the President and Business Agent for the Boston Commons Union, represents thousands of workers at the MBTA, a lot of which you just heard from Lee. Those jobs are actually potentially the ones going to be cut from these MBTA cuts. I'd like to start by thanking Mayor Walsh and his team for speaking out against the proposed drastic service cuts at the MBTA. means a lot to the people who are most affected by these cuts to have their support. Public transit is a necessary public service. Reducing public transportation should never be an option. It provides transportation for people who are less fortunate or who may not have any other way to get from one place to another. It is at the core of our economy. It reduces greenhouse gases that contribute to global warming, and it provides good middle-class jobs. The people who continue to rely on transit during this pandemic are largely from low-income communities that have been hit hardest by COVID-19. They are most likely to be frontline workers, healthcare providers, jobs that just cannot be done from home. These planned cuts will hurt the communities that have been hit hardest by this deadly virus and hurt the essential workers, including the essential workers at the MBTA who have risked everything while providing this vital service. These people have suffered the greatest losses during this pandemic, and it is unfair to ask them to suffer even greater loss. The brave workers we represent are essential workers. They have risked getting infected by this terrible virus and have often brought it home and infected their families. They are now facing losing their jobs and health care during a pandemic. With a vaccine around the corner, the MBTA officials and legislators need to find a way to avoid these cuts so that we don't hurt the people who have been hit the hardest over the last 10 months. We are calling on the MBTA and our elected officials to stop these devastating cuts. We are also asking our elected officials to pass legislation that would bring progressive forms of revenue to help the MBTA, not just in a recovery effort, but to properly fund the MBTA into the future. We need to preserve our public transit system. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jimmy. Now I'm going to have Rich Domino from A Better City to speak, and then we'll open up for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As president and CEO of A Better City, my board represents the strongest economic drivers of the Commonwealth's business sector. And I can't be prouder as a representative of the business community to be here with Mayor Walsh and his leadership, the leadership of Council President Cheney and the Boston City Council, our friends in organized labor and the advocacy community. Business community, government, and organized labor and advocates standing together asking that the Fiscal Management Control Board do not cut services at the MBTA. As a representative of the business community, countless members of the workforce count on the transit system to come into Boston and the urban core and to travel throughout the metropolitan region every single day. Before the pandemic, over 60% of the commuters that were coming into the city every day were using the MBTA. We all know what happens when the MBTA does not provide service. In the winter of 2015, we saw the critical implications of lack of workforce into the workplace and days of endless congestion. The transit system is a critical element of our economy. It's a foundation of our economy. And as we lean in and address the issues of the COVID pandemic and look to economic recovery, now's not the time to be cutting transit. As we move into the spring and the summer and vaccines are beginning to take place in our community, we want to see the workforce return to Boston. And a lot of that workforce, as we have done surveys to find out, want to get back on the T. And in Boston, we have a significant transit-dependent ridership that count on the T to get to work. Workforce, getting back to work, transit-dependent riders, people that are critical to our economy, that relates to us being able to connect people to jobs, to where they live, to where the jobs here are in Boston. Boston is the economic center of the region. The urban core drives the economy of the Commonwealth, and we must remember that the transit system, again, is the cornerstone of that economic opportunity. Again, I want to thank the mayor, the Boston City Council, our friends in organized labor, and the advocate community. We must make sure that the transit system is there for us. We can't support these cuts, and we need to go into an economic recovery with the transit system being a fundamental part of that strategy. Mayor, again, thank you so much for inviting me today.
I want to thank Rick, and I want to thank all the speakers today. And Rick just said something. Boston is the economic engine for all of New England, and to just simply not roll up our sleeves, the Fiscal Management Review Board, the legislature roll up their sleeves and work through and figure out a solution here. We're erasing transportation, and that has going to have long-term severe impacts potentially to our city, to our state, to our region. And those are the concerns that I have, and those are the concerns that the folks behind me have here today. So with that, I'll open up for questions.
Would you back raising taxes to keep service the same, even with so many fewer riders as they have now?
Yeah, 2013, one of my last votes in the legislature was the gas tax to increase gas with indexing, and that money was supposed to go into funding not just keeping T service but improving service. So the answer is yes. There's ways of being creative. We just had an opportunity with the budget that just went through the House and the Senate to make some investments or do some temporary fixes, and that vehicle was not used. So there is an opportunity. I'd also use ride sharing. Look at charging ride-sharing companies, and I'd also look at giving the city of Boston. We filed legislation to allow a regional ballot question that would allow us the ability to raise our own revenue. So if they don't want to do that, then let us raise our revenue. We'll raise our revenue for them.
Mayor, are you confident if the fee delays because that the federal government will pass some sort of stimulus plan before the next fiscal year?
Well, I think we have to wait. I mean, today there's a meeting in Congress today. They're having a conversation over almost $1 trillion relief package. Incorporated in that is some other things that we have to look at, transit. And then I am confident that the Biden-Harris administration will work with Congress and the United States Senate to pass legislation. There was definitely a desire to pass legislation last term under President Trump. The problem was Trump wouldn't sit down with the leaders of the Democratic Party, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, to come up with a funding package. I mean, it's all documented. Republicans and Democrats wanted to pass it in the Senate and the House. Maybe different versions, but I am confident that this Congress, along with the new president coming in, will pass legislation to deal with transit. Transit has to be addressed in this country. We have crumbling roads and bridges all across America. We have insufficiencies in our rail across America. If we don't address that issue on a national level, our infrastructure will crumble. And what type of country will we be then?
Several recent reports have shown a culture in BPD of police officers covering up each other's crimes, letting each other off the hook. So far, the city hasn't said much on that. What's the plan there? How do you intend to tackle that?
Well, the reports that you're referring to were from 2009 and 2013, prior to me being mayor or the police commissioner being commissioner. And we just, the police task force, just passed some significant reforms in the Boston Police Department that we're going to be creating an independent board, not a co-op board, but a board that's going to be investigating the internal affair cases, which this case, at least the 2013 case, would have been in front of, and also create a citizens advisory board. And right now, the city council is creating. We're waiting for the city council to take action on creating the executive director position and board.
Report mentioned the role of the supervisor who remains in a BPD leadership role. I believe he's now captain. Should a BPD supervisor who ignored misconduct or criminal behavior face discipline or termination?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure if that person at that time ignored misconduct. I know there was some documentation, at least for 2013. I'll have to look into the 2009 situation.
Now, Governor Baker and the MBTA have heard things like this before, saying cutting is going to have a negative impact on minorities, on the working class. Do you think calls like this, do you think they're listening? Do you think this will change their
I think they're listening, because the vote's supposed to be this week and it's postponed for a week already. And I think, again, the Fiscal Management Review Board was created for a short period. It wasn't supposed to be ever meant to be a permanent board. They need to listen, and they better listen, because the people that are here represent people, whether it's in labor, whether it's in community, whether it's in the elected officials. You need to listen to us. The impacts are. I'm not sure if the folks on the Fiscal Management Control Board are an executive of a city, run a city and run an industry. They need to pay attention to what's going to happen here if they make these cuts. Any other questions?
What message to people who don't take public transportation and they don't want to support higher taxes?
I think that I'm not sure the people that don't take public transit. I think that a lot of people aren't taking it because they don't have confidence in the system. And prior to COVID, there was hundreds of millions of dollars of investment going into the MBTA to upgrade the service. In fairness to the MBTA and the general manager, there was lots of investments going on there, and they were trying to build confidence in the system. We need to have a strong, reliable public transit system in this region. And I don't think there are people that necessarily are against the MBTA and said we don't want to cut it and end the service. That would be devastating to our economy, devastating to our city and our state. All right, thanks everybody.